Today we have a special guest and a team from United States. Actually, so it's my pleasant duty to introduce as well as mention about the agenda that we will be following for the day in the morning session. So first, let me welcome the team, specifically the US Science Envoy, Dr. LaShanda Korley, and warm welcome. And of course, with her, we have the other members, Christopher Gush from the US Embassy, that is actually in charge, obviously in charge of science diplomacy, and heading or responsible with environmental science, technology, and health. Also, we have the Brian Bedell, who is from the US State Department, and he's a regional policy coordinator. So again, welcome. Of course, I must thank Jovine Machado, who is an economic specialist, again, environmental science, technology, and health from the US Embassy, who actually coordinated this event with us. So a special thanks for organizing this and enabling us to have another visitor talk at Faculty of Graduate Studies, University of Moratuwa. And more so, we look forward to not just that one presentation, but a little bit more long-term commitment in understanding with our university. So before that, I must also welcome members of staff from Department of Material Science and Engineering, Head Sivuha. He's also the Director of Quality Assurance of the entire University of Moratuwa. And Professor Shanta Kodage, who heads the Department of Chemical and Process Engineering, and Professor Shanta Walpalge, Professor Ruan Gopura, who is our Director of Office of Research. So today what we hope is to have a session discussion on, and you're welcome who joined us from, not just from University of Moratuwa, from outside as well. So let me, first we will have this session on the reimagining plastic waste as a valuable feedstock, which has two parts really, and also we'll be discussing science diplomacy. It's important because I think as US Science Envoy, we also should understand science communication and the role the science can play in building bridges. And I think these are desperately needed in this time, specifically with so many issues and so many problems around us. So to start the proceedings, first to introduce the speaker. She's a distinguished professor in material science and engineering and chemical and biochemical engineering at the University of Delaware. And she's also a fellow of the American Physical Society, American Chemical Society, Division of Polymeric Materials, Science and Engineering, and the American Institute for Medical and Biological Engineering. She is also the director of an Energy Frontier Research Center, the Center for Plastic Innovation, funded by the Department of Energy. Dr. Korley is a global leader in using biologically inspired and sustainable principles for the molecular design, manufacture, and valorization of functional polymeric systems. I'm sure biomimicry is something that is quite fascinates as an individual here, myself. So look forward to listening to that part of as well, because in addition to going through this molecular biopolymers, she has a special interest in biomimicry. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. LaShanda to have the first part, and there will be a short break. And with that, and you can also rejoin about after 15-minute breaks of the first presentation.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity to come and visit. I've only been here, I would say less than 48 hours, but beautiful, beautiful, beautiful area. I have a special connection, I think, to this university. One of my former PhD students, Nandula Wanasakara, was here, right? And so this is one of the places that I wish I would have been able to see him when I came to visit. But there is a special place in terms of Sri Lanka for me, with him being one of my first PhD students. So I wanted to start by kind of framing some of the work that we do, especially related to the science diplomacy, science policy, and making sure that we're thinking about this from a global perspective. And what really drives me are a couple of pictures that are listed here. So one, these are plastic rocks, quote unquote, that were found in Brazil. And this to me really highlighted the plastics pollution problem, which is part of the work that I'm really focused on in my engagement as a science envoy. And here we actually see rock formation that is infused with the plastic that is, we see around us, right? So this plastics pollution problem. I recently returned from Ghana, and here are some pictures that highlight the plastics pollution on the beaches in Ghana. So for me, this really highlights what we need to be thinking about from a cultural perspective. One is that all of the different solutions that we're creating as scientists have to really be framed in the context of our cultural environment, but also what are the trade-offs in terms of our infrastructure. So things like waste management and how it varies across different countries. Things about the trade-off between creating sustainable energy sources and also air quality are important as we start to tackle some of these research frameworks in terms of the science related to plastics pollution. I want to frame this, and I think this is important when we start to think about plastics policy and the science related to it, is that we're not going to get rid of plastics. I have actually been very enthused by the fact that in the hotel, not a lot of single-use plastics, right? There are no plastic water bottles. That's very different than what I see in the US as I'm walking around. But we're not going to get rid of plastics because they provide a lot of benefits to us, right? So we all know this, that they reduce transportation costs from energy and pollution perspective. They provide durability and convenience and insulation for us. There's processability that allows us to make the different products that we need. It also allows us to think about things like preserving food and medicine. And so those are things that are really important. So from a policy perspective, we need to take into, as scientists and engineers, we need to take in the fact that there are things that are framing how we do the work that we do, but we need to think about ways in which we can start to connect the cultural aspects as well as what we know from our classroom and research-based studies to be able to now really start to think about ways we can invoke things like reduce, reuse, reimagine. If I think about this from a cost-benefit analysis here from a plastics, they have enormous societal benefits, but we think about this from both the fact that we have a very linear way in which we think about plastics. We go from production to use to end of life. And what we really need to think about as we start to set policies, as we start to engage across borders, is to really think about what can we do with these and to mitigate some of the challenges around microplastics, around pollution, waste accumulation, and environmental pollution. And part of this is driven by the fact that global plastics production is huge and continues to rise, right? So things like polyolefins, like polypropylene, HDPE and LDPE, of course, are really dominating this. There are also other types of material systems, right? So PET, polystyrene, polyurethanes. There's also recycled plastics that are in the market, and then there are also bioplastics, which we'll talk a little bit about after the break. So from that perspective, as we start to think about the conversations that we're having, how can we think about these really a small subset of plastics that are problematic for us, and to think about ways in which we can start to recycle, reuse these material systems. And why are we driving this? Well, one is because there's a lot of heterogeneity in plastics, right? So even though we see these numbers, recycling numbers for PET, HDPE, there's more to that, right? So you can have them in different forms. You can have them as powders and pellets and monoliths. You can have them as films and fibers and also as foams. And all of these require very different types of processes for us to mitigate them, right, or to recycle them. Now, why is this important in thinking about how we talk about these from a perspective of reaching across borders? How these materials are used vary from country to country, but we also have to educate the people around us about the fact that if we have something as a film, it's very different than if we have something as a foam, right? And how you would be able to mitigate or recycle that material. There are also aspects related to things around how long are the polymers that we're using? Are they in multi-layer formed? How do we actually collect materials? Are they collected as mixed waste streams or not? There's also the impact of things like additives on plastic products. So for us, we try to think about this and create this landscape, because as we start to think about things like what are going to be global mitigation strategies for plastics pollution, I think it's important that scientists and engineers are at the forefront of this conversation, because we really understand what the unique factors are at play. So things like plastic additives, they're present everywhere. So you can think about this one plastic bag that has all of these different components in them, right? So it has fillers, it has plasticizers, has flame retardants and antioxidants. We know that different stores want to use different colors or different inks so that they can brand their particular material system. And so this is really important as we start to think about sustainable packaging, as we start to think about bio-based packaging. How do we use these different types of materials? Can we replace them with things that are less harmful and ones that are not going to impact the recycling infrastructure? We can also think about multi-layer films. Multi-layer films are used all over the place, right? And so when we as a customer see a bag, we think about, okay, it's one component, but it typically isn't, right? It has multiple types of polymers. One may be providing a barrier layer, one may provide structure to the material, and one may provide some other type of function. And then they also have small molecules that provide a tie layer to enhance adhesion. So you don't have to worry about the chemical structures, but really what's important is that there's a diversity to what's happening. And if you start to think about interfaces and other material systems, this needs to be a part of the conversation, right? When we talk about how to mitigate or how to replace plastics packaging. And so these are some ways they're used. They're used for laminated containers. They're used for bag and wrapping materials. And there are some inherent challenges related to these types of materials. But there are some promising avenues, and this is where I think holding hands across the globe is important, because the solutions that are created here in Sri Lanka are important part of the conversation to the things that may be going on in the US and in other parts of the world. So if you can start to think about now reimagining this linear economy related to plastics, from feedstocks to plastics to discarded plastics, to now what can we innovate in the lab, right? So bioprocessing, right? Can we do some type of chemical deconstruction or biological deconstruction process to both create new material systems, but also to recover the building blocks to make the same material? Can we start to use nature that's around us, right? So can we use things like trees as an input to create new feedstock materials? And then can we innovate in the lab to think about ways to create more circular polymers that are already inherently ones that can go into a more circular type of plastics economy? So for us, there's opportunities as we start to have this conversation to rethink materials, to redesign materials, and to direct to new markets. So there are lots of things that we can think about as we start to discover this, and is to address some of the chemical challenges around bond energy, trade-off between the types of products that you can actually recover from this process, and then really understanding a lot around material-specific things, right? So I say this often, and I say this to non-scientists, so let me belabor this point, because I hope we all say it, that polymers are not small molecules. And a lot of people really think that the same strategies that you use for organic chemistry will work for these types of systems, because the timescales are slower because you have long chains. There are lots of interactions that are important that are driven by the fact that you may have branching and things in these polymers. So for us, this type of information is important. there are opportunities for us to dig back into the coffers related to the work that has been done before and in lots of different industry. And this is where I think people can start connecting the dots. Hydro treatment of polyolefins is important, and that's been used in terms of the chemical industry for years. So hydrocracking, hydrogenolysis, those types of catalytic methods are ones that we can rediscover to deal with plastics. There's also the opportunity to rethink the potential of these materials to replace traditional routes to create new types of functional polymers. And this connects with what I think is important around biomimicry, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then so there are also opportunities for us to use what's been working in lots of places. A lot of cultures have an inherent circularity to them, and I think that needs to be a part of the conversation. And so are there ways that we can learn from, say, enzymes to deconstruct plastics? Are there renewable material opportunities? And these are some things that, you know, are important to us, and we'll go into specifics later. I also think there's an opportunity for us to really think about innovation, and this is where the work that I'm doing is important. So in my role as a U.S. Science Envoy, I'm a private citizen ambassador, but I'm passionate about connecting science and engineering across borders, right? My research group has benefited and it has thrived by the fact that I have diverse researchers from all over the world, right? Who bring their own unique perspectives and understanding to tackle the challenges that are increasingly interdisciplinary and increasingly global. And the policy aspect, to me, comes into play in the fact that policy cannot be abstract of science, and they have to work hand in hand, right? And it also has to recognize that people and how we consume products are important to solutions, right? So creating a solution that works in the US may not work here, right? A solution here may not work someplace else. So being able to hold hands, quote unquote, is important to us being able to drive global solutions to what are increasingly interconnected, interdisciplinary, and very global problems. So of course we have to do what we do in the lab, right? So we have to have scientific advances that span experimental research, computation, data science, and systems analysis. And these are places where I hope that we can build connections, right? So from a research perspective. But we also have to think about how we include other stakeholders in the process. And so corporate action is important. So understanding industry, which is increasingly global, right? So as we start to think about policy and mandates that are made, just because those may be enacted for Europe or for the US, because those companies also sell all around the world, effectively they become policy or mandates for every place that they do business. We also have to build community partnerships, and that's extremely important to me. To really be able to think about the grassroots efforts that are happening, how do we educate people about the problems that are at play? And then that goes hand in hand with public policy. And I think from a research perspective, this means that what we're doing is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We are creating many plug-and-play types of solutions that can work for different types of problems in different types of settings. And this is why for something like, I'm using plastics pollution because that's the area in which I'm focusing for my science envoy role, systems analysis is really important. Can we look at the whole problem and really start to think about what is the system that we're trying to optimize to create solutions for? Data science is going to be important, the work that you all are doing here, being able to correlate with some of the things that are happening in other places. Modeling and machine learning and artificial intelligence are going to be extremely important in this process. And this requires a network of researchers, right? So can we start to create predictive tools? And this spans, chemistry, data science, electrical engineering, polymers, chemical engineering. We have to really be able to draw these correlations that I talked about, and we have to be able to use things like data science. So the work that we may be doing in biomimicry could also be quite relevant to some of the problems that we're trying to tackle with plastics pollution, and how do we mine that data to be able to extract that for different purposes. I think there are ways that we need to think about what are the energy barriers to sustainability, because some of the problems that we're trying to solve may also create more problems, all right? And then there's also the opportunity that we need to connect things across the life cycle toward value. Value means different things to different people. You know, for example, on one of my last science envoy trips, pyrolysis may not be considered as a viable method in certain countries to use plastics waste. But if that actually creates fuel for a village, that has value, right? Because that now means they're not burning plastic and creating more environmental pollution, right? And so being able to create value means different things in different places. So I really think we have to rethink plastics globally, and hopefully you've seen where policy and diplomacy come into play, but we need to create things like industrial adoption of renewable feedstocks. Well, what does that mean? And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next part of the presentation. We also need to think about sustainability holistically. What we do in the lab, how we process materials, how we think about catalysis requires us, you know, talking about precious minerals and things like that earlier. A lot of catalysts use rare earth metals, right? And so can we think about more earth abundant catalysts that will allow us to mitigate some of those pieces? We also want to think about how we manufacture materials, right? Are we being sustainable in those processes? Are we reducing the number of components that are a material? We always want things that are bigger and better, right? But we can now, with all the advances that we're all doing in the lab, we can now reduce the number of components to potentially get the same functionality. And then we also have to think about consumer use and set expectations. I love the expectations that are being set here in Sri Lanka. You know, I went to the gym this morning and it clearly said, we no longer provide plastic water bottles, right? So you either need to bring your own, or we have paper cups for you. That was it, right? There was nothing else. So being able to set expectations of how we're going to take care of our natural resources is important, and being able to get that messaging out. I think we also have to address challenging materials. So some of the work that I love to do is to think about these recalcitrant types of materials, whether they're multi-layers or thermosets or real plastics, and address those. So to move away from model systems to, you know, actual complex materials. And then just to really be able to, you know, hit home here that plastics are definitely a community concern. And there needs to be a seat at the innovation table for all. And this is why this was important for me to be able to do. So when I started as a US Science Envoy, it was extremely important for me to have all of these pieces, right? So that there's the science, which is the forefront, that's my expertise level. But I also feel like we have to be able to cut across policy borders to include connections with corporate, community partnerships, and policymakers in order to be able to really impact this particular challenge. And so being able to coordinate policy priorities that validate the systems. So that's getting real data, right? That's being able to open borders and to be able to really understand what's going on. And then being able to drive education to support these steps, right? And so that's the education that we're doing to our, you know, with our trainees, but also educating the public about what we should be doing. But there's still a lot that we must do. We need to make sure that we can still have a vibrant plastics economy. It's not going away for some of the reasons that I mentioned before. But we need to design with circularity in mind. We need to redesign processes. And there have to be opportunities to redirect to new markets in this particular case. And so I'll leave you with this. There's more information. So I am the director of the Center for Plastics Innovation, which is a partnership between the University of Delaware, University of Pennsylvania, UMass Amherst, UChicago, and Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the US. And this is a Department of Energy funded Energy Frontier Research Center focused on mitigating plastics waste through catalytic recycling, biocatalysis, and other efforts. But you see here that the way that we think about this is that there are many complementary approaches to tackle this. And there's a QR code if you're interested in learning more about the center. One of the things that we are starting as part of this center is a global seminar series, because we do believe that there's a global nature to this work. And so we are open to inviting people to give talks on the work that they're doing, especially related to plastics innovation, plastics recycling, and upcycling, because it's important to me, it's important to us that this conversation with global problems such as plastics pollution needs to include all stakeholders, right? That it is specific to different areas, it's specific to other infrastructure challenges that may be going on, and that there's a diversity that is even within this particular countries that needs to be highlighted as we work towards solutions. So with that part of my talk complete, I welcome any questions that you may have related to some of this work, but also to, talks around my role as a science envoy and some of the things that we see. So thank you.
We take a few questions now. I have a question. Now, Sri Lanka as a policy, at one point, we went in for oxo-degradable. And so we have these bags we claim as degradable, biodegradable, but in fact, what we have is oxo-degradable. Have we gone from the frying pan in the fire to that policy decision?
So, here's my take on it, right? So I think that there is a place for biodegradation in this idea of packaging. That's a big conversation. But just because you make a material from a biological source, trees, whatever, doesn't mean that it's inherently biodegradable. And it's still, if you're making a replacement for polyethylene or for polyurethane, it's still a polyurethane, right? You just made it from a biodegradable source, which doesn't mean that it's inherently biodegradable. You don't know what you're getting out of it. And do you have the infrastructure to be able to ensure degradation at the rates that you want without the accumulation? That's the part that I think we have to consider as we're starting to do this. Making biodegradable materials is great, but even in the US, there are certain parts where there are industrial composting units that you can take them to and deal with them, but that's not everywhere, right? And so there is a social equity issue of whether you have a biodegradation set up at your house under whatever conditions that you're talking about, right? For these different materials. So I think that there are trade-offs, and part of it still has to deal with waste management, and part of it also has to deal with the infrastructure that we have in place to deal with these biodegradable packaging.
The polymer specialty, but this particular material that we are using, they have starch.
That's pro-oxidants.
Yeah, so really the
pro-oxidants to disintegrate, and then it's not biodegradable actually.
Okay.
That is what Professor Ajit raised here.
Are we accelerating the microplastic, nanoplastic issue through that process?
So you could be. I think part of it is you have to look at what the degradation pathways are for this material. What does it degrade into, and how fast does that happen, right? Are you, what are the variabilities depending on whatever, the environmental conditions that would lead to different types of products? How can it go awry, right? I think that's the part that you have to ask the questions about.
Ask a question kind of you all in academia. What is your relationship with policymakers and businesses?
Actually, that's one of the good question. Now, in one side we have the policymakers, the other side industry. When the policymakers use some, just some documents of the industry come to us like asking that they are sometimes against the policies. They are thinking about the current situation, like the prices, the profit and all. One side we do the policies, the other side the industry most of the time come to us, and very recently we have one thing, they are not much reluctant to directly at those policies. And maybe the side of the the general public, the cost is one of the main factors. Anything like come as a new biodegradable one, cost is maybe 2 times greater than that. That's another problem when you go out of the policy making. Those are the questions we face, but sometimes we have no answer for that.
Yeah, I think at times it's important to have everyone at the table, right? Because we tend to do these in isolation, right? So we talk to industry about the science innovations, and they may have a cost number. We don't necessarily do the studies to figure out what consumers would actually, be willing to pay for a particular product, or do you need to have it in a specialized area so that the cost isn't, such an issue. So a lot of times, some of the materials that have these innovations around circularity may be used for more specialty applications, so the cost isn't as important. But when you have these more pairwise, instead of having everybody at the table, I think it becomes more difficult to really solve the problem.
They are doing that one, like with the policymakers, with the industry, they get together and do the discussion.
Yeah, currently you have this issue with the extended producer responsibility. Going to come up with a couple of plastic items to start with. Then we have entire industry, the Chamber of Commerce.
Industry is forced to do that one. They go to do that. Otherwise, they can basically run industry. Still, they have some concerns.
Yeah.
I think beyond all, in Sri Lanka, most of the time, with respect to the policies are questionable by the industry and the general public. So, the accuracy of the policy, what is the real research back to impose this particular policy, and what is the time frame? Is it really practical? So all these things are really political and also questionable. Because sometimes we just get the policies or other carbon copy of the policy from another country, and we are trying to impose them here without knowing the industry and the culture of the country. So it's fair. You can. Simple example is this banning of cement fiber, the asbestos. So imposed after a while, that was turned down due to various reasons. So like that, the policies are like sort of jokes in the countries with respect to some of the especially the environment related policies.
So what do you think are solutions to handling that? Because what do you think a solution is to handling that? I've heard this in multiple places that I've been. They're not practical, right? Like you said, we try to have a one-size-fits-all solution for every country. We say this works here, so it should work here. What do you think are some ways to deal with it?
The main reason I found is, they are not really consulting the correct stakeholders. Now, let's say the universities we are willing to join hand with them, but they never consult us. They only go through the strategies and the directives given by the institutes, and the institutes are really political. The head post, and the next level is hanging on the top level. So like that, the entire structure is political. Because of this political influence, they are not really getting the correct feedback from the professionals who should be in the table. So that may be to me it's the reason.
Ask another question. How does the funding for university research work? Does the
Which person is the next and the guy here?
Unfortunately, from the university, last few years, we didn't have any funding. Usually from the state university, we receive funding from the government. Last few years, because of the COVID-19 situation, we didn't receive any funding. Therefore, research funding was also almost zero. But again, now we are trying to start some funding scheme for the research. But compared with US, it's very, very negligible amount.
Do you engage with universities abroad or experts like Dr. Korley? I mean, what is your relationship with
We
international
have separately different staff members, they have collaborations. So we have some big grants from the different universities. As example, I have one grant with Imperial College London, and I think Professor Andy has a grant with in Europe, right? Likewise, individual staff members, they have some grants, but overall, from the government side for the research, funding is almost zero.
What about from industry?
And a few comments to what Gopal stated. I mean, of course, we are not getting funding from the government, and we can't rely on the government funding at the situation like this. I mean, everywhere in the entire world is going. I mean, they all question about the research funding. Are we really giving a value addition to the funding given by the state? So that is one question number one. So because of that, I don't want to question the funding coming from the state. That's one side of the story. But when you think about the university, I think more than the funding from the state, we should rely on the industry. So we should go to the industry, and industry should come to the university. So they should have to have a win-win situation at a platform where we can discuss the issues openly. So we have to create, as a university, we should create a platform for the industry to come and state the issues, and we should be able to opt and say, okay, we will be able to solve the issue. And you have a platform for us to get or rather win the grants to the university or get the funding. But unfortunately, at University of Morato, I mean, when if I really open up the scenario, this particular platform is really missing. So we are relying on only one aspect, that is the state. So state is not funding, that's it. So we should not do research. That should not be the way. A university should focus more on the industry. We should invite the industry to come and work with the university, and at least for the people who have initiated, the university should be able to support. But unfortunately, that structure is really very low at Sri Lankan University. I'm not really blaming the University of Morato. That is very weak, because the industry is not really trusting the universities, because they don't know whether whatever the funding they give to the university, they will not get the return at the end of the period. So they don't have the trust, because we have not really proven a trustworthy relationship with industry. So they have a problem, and we are also not really geared enough to go to the industry and say, okay, we are willing. I mean, we have a lot of capabilities. We have the professional in the university where we can come and solve your problem. So we don't have that particular platform in the country. So altogether,
You talk a little bit about that relationship, your relationship with business in the US.
Just adding one item about the partnership. Right now, Morato has a project with Melbourne on plastics and machine learning and source separation. So there's the element of the AI part is the data side part is happening from Morato.
The other biggest issue is the collaboration is very weak in state universities in Sri Lanka. We don't collaborate with each other. Even within the university, we don't work in groups. So the industry is not really happy enough to come and work with us, because we are with our own, sort of the professional silos. So we are not really open to work with the others. So they don't want to come and work with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in the US there's and it is dependent upon the university, but I think some ways in which industry partnerships. So in the US, I think a lot of companies that used to have an R&D component are now shifting to engaging with industry. So the model, if there's a long-term research need, they now are working with universities, and so that has kind of shifted. Some companies have their top universities that they work with. Some of them are part of industrial consortiums. So creating an industrial consortium that if you typically work in silos, creating a group of people who can come together even from multiple universities in specific knowledge areas, whether that could be machine learning or data science or some aspect, right? That's one way that partnerships tend to happen. in the US. Sometimes, so you describe something that I think has increasingly happened for some of the institutes, where companies will come and pitch problems, right? They say, we have a set of dollars, and we want to hear what are your best solutions to these particular problems. Another way is through trainee internships and exchanges. So being able to support either through fellowships for some of your graduate students, or offering undergraduate students research internships. That's also a partnership building way that has worked in the US.
And you have a good research autonomy in your university. You have that particular power. You have the autonomy for you to do research. But unfortunately, many, I mean, I'm not really picking the model university, but it's not in that culture is not there in Sri Lanka, so it's sad.
Yeah, I think that is and I think US again is not a monolith. I think that there are some universities which have a stronger kind of research engine, and others who are building it. There are different types of universities. And so a lot of times what we'll do is to bring together different types of universities as a way to kind of make that bridge happen and create that research engine or ecosystem that will enable that, right? To build that kind of collaborative culture. I also heard you talk a lot about the trust, right? So the trust between entities and the university. And part of that is about capacity building. That's about having the infrastructure and the mechanisms for checks and balances on things, right? It's what I'm hearing from you, right? And I think that there are those same things happen at other places, right? But being able to build that through, that type of partnership, even just one example, if you can have one solid example, that could work.
As Professor Antika mentioned, that one of the major problems is that the industry problem are time bound. Like, if all the structures are not in line, very difficult to deliver within the time. That's the main problem we have. Like, we are engaging with a number of problems more than now 10, 15 years. That is the major problem we face. And also sometimes the human resource problem is another one. That was another problem when we take the project. Sometimes at the middle, that person is somewhat going away. Then we face a lot of problems. We were doing that one, like we have incubator and all, but it was very difficult. It's very stressful for us even. Like the industry, Sri Lankan industry are very time-bound industry because they are running with difficulties. They spend money, they expect return as quickly as possible. Not like long-term research, as you mentioned that US, there are very long-term research, then we are comfortable. But the short-term research, actually, the current structure we have, very difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand and appreciate that. I think that I think it depends on the industry and depends on the problem, right? So sometimes we have 6-month contracts, which means that we need to have someone who's ready before the project starts, right? Who's already up to speed. Sometimes, if I can push it, I want at least 18 months or 24 months to work on a problem. But the human resource challenge, I think, is one that we all are facing, which brings up a different problem, like or a different question around what is your kind of student enrollment and student interest in science and engineering. How is the country dealing with, because I think a lot of people are thinking about that human resource challenge as we are starting to grow these technical areas.
Now the situation we have very worst, actually speaking. To get the chemical even is a problem. Like even we have money, we cannot get the chemicals. Importing restriction. There are a lot of problems we are faced with.
So in your presentation, you did not cover about the microbeads. Is it a big problem in US? The intentionally added the beads?
You mean adding it to like cosmetics and things like that?
Yeah.
So we're increasingly learning about the problem, right? I think there have been more studies now where we're starting to see the impacts, and now people are now saying, okay, we need to think about this formulation in a different way. It's not something that I personally work on quite a bit,
but there are lots of studies on the microplastics, especially from cosmetics, that are happening now. And I think it's gonna transform what we're doing in the beauty and healthcare, industry as we start to think about that. It hasn't been a huge part of the conversation, but it is increasingly, because I think we're now starting to see the effects as we're looking at kind of that long-term aspect.
So now I want to switch gears a little bit to talk a little bit more on the technical side of some of the work that we do. So my research group, I have currently 9 PhD students, 4 postdocs, and a couple of undergraduate students in my lab, and we work mainly on 3 themes. One is on nature-inspired material systems, and I'll give a couple examples of some things we do in that space. Bio-derived and tailored materials, and then the work that we do on valorization of end-of-life plastics. So those are kind of the 3 main areas of my group. Today, I'll spend a little bit of time talking to you about some of the work that we do in the nature and the biomimicry and the bio-derived material systems. So I'll start today. So these are some of the examples of some of the things we work on. I only have time because I want to touch on some of the biodegradable material systems too, but I'm happy to talk about this later. 2 systems that we think quite a bit about are silk. So I have been working in the area of spider silk as an inspiration for materials design since I was a graduate student many years ago. We also look at things like pine cones and try to understand how we can make intelligent composites, looking at the opening and closing of those pine cones. But I'll only share with you a little bit about the silk work today, but can talk about some of the things that we do in that space if there's interest later. So when we think about nature-inspired material systems, I'm fascinated with them. I'm actually allergic to spiders, but I am fascinated by their toughness, the intricacy of how they process materials. But if you look at something like pine cones, these are composite structures. So as a material person, looking at how you use different layered structures, looking at the tunability of how you can generate these composites to get opening and closing and twisting and curling of plant tendrils is fascinating to me. In spider silk, you think about the chemical diversity and how you can use that diversity of how you put together different sequences to generate different chain interactions. So things like hydrogen bonding or pi-pi stacking that then give rise to these self-assembled structures and things like alpha helical structures or beta sheets. And then also the fact that there's not only the chemical architecture and these structures, the self-assembled structures, but there's also something magic that happens in the spinneret of a spider, right? So there's something about processing of these material systems to induce a specific order that gives rise to this unique toughness. And as a polymer person, as a chemical engineer, to me that's fascinating because it really spans the things that interest me, right? So there's the chemistry, there's the processing, and then everything in between that is really this one material can help us to think about. So our definition of biomimicry is not trying to completely, is this, okay, perfect. So there's not just trying to mimic a specific material, all of their features, but to really look at nature as a framework for new polymeric materials design. So that goes from looking at the hierarchy in natural material systems. So we can start with things like the chemical structure, where you can use the different residues to generate hydrophilicity and hydrophobicity or different associative behavior. Then you can go up another level to self-assembled structures, which provides this reinforcement effect or responsiveness. And then you can also tune the topology of materials. So if you compare, say, the cricket and the shark skin, where you can get differences in adhesion and wetting and drag reduction in these materials. If I go back to my friend, the spider web, right? So the spider web, you have the macroscopic web. You then can think about what are the silk fibrillar structures there. And then if you go down another level in length scale, you can think about this as a hetero-nanocomposite, where you have these beta sheets that physically cross-link a glycine-rich matrix. And it's this hydrogen bonding that gives rise to the self-assembled structures. There's also differences in the function of a silk web. So if you look at major ampulate silk, you can think about how the spider moves around. So if you see a spider moving around in a corner, that silk has a very different property than the viscid silk. So what's made of the web where you would actually catch the prey. That's the sticky one that you don't want to run into in the corner. You get it all over you. You're like, what's happening, right? So there are differences in, say, the size scale of the organization of these materials. And if you look at the plot in the middle, the stress versus strain curve, you start to see differences in the mechanics of these materials. So the frame has a very high modulus, whereas the web, the actual viscid silk, has a low modulus but a high extensibility. So those are extremely important in thinking about this combination of architecture and then how it performs and is processed. There's also differences in the type of spider, right? So each spider has slightly different properties. If you are familiar with the brown recluse spider, it actually doesn't spin a web in the traditional sense. It doesn't spin a cylindrical web. It actually extrudes a flat ribbon that has nodules on it, which gives it specific adhesion. So understanding kind of that biodiversity of what we see out these windows, and then being able to utilize that to create functional materials is important. It's something that we've been thinking about quite a bit. So I'll start, we've been working on this since 2007. So this is 16 years worth of work, but I'm only going to show you some more recent work that we've been doing on functional materials. And this was driven by thinking about making bio-inspired hybrids that have more than just mechanics and hierarchy, which we talked about. So being able to generate materials that have the functional mechanical properties, but also generate things like shape, memory, behavior that's captured in this tensile plot on the right. So if we want to engineer this functionality, we go from something, if you think about a spider web, it has bending resistance, it has stress distributions in the fibular structures, it gives stimuli responsive and toughness behavior. And so all of this is really driven by this hierarchy and the non-covalent structures that are there. And that can be used to help us develop materials that are smart so that you can have desired tunability and mechanical properties, but also stimuli responsive behavior. And so here's just a synthetic scheme where in our case, we go back to that idea of making a hetero-nanocomposite, and we're making polyurethane hybrid materials, okay? So here we have N-carboxy anhydride polyamino acid with a PDMS. We use an isocyanate and we vary the repeat length so that we have these material systems that are non-chain extended polyurethane, polyurea hybrid materials. So we make these where we have some that are primarily beta sheet and some that are primarily alpha helical structures. We make films of these in a pretty simple way. We dissolve it in THF, we cast in the mold, and we do a solvent annealing step. What's nice is that you see at the bottom, we can make pretty large scale films, and we can also make them quite flexible using this approach there. You know, clear, transparent, so you can start to think about the different types of applications you could use for this, these types of materials. Here we can alter the secondary structure conformation through the repeat lengths. So as I mentioned before, if we have a repeat length of 5 at different compositions, we have all beta sheets. If we use a longer repeat length, so this A20 here, we see that we start to increase the amount of alpha helical structures with these systems. You can also use solvent to promote one or the other. Why is this important? Is because now you're getting a balance of versus intramolecular hydrogen bonding, which gives you differences in secondary structure, but also in how it responds mechanically. What's nice about these material systems is the secondary structure now allows us to control phase separation. So in 3 of the series, you get a phase separated structure, and then in 1, you get a phase mixed structure. So beta sheet ordering tends to promote more phase mixing because you have more intermolecular hydrogen bonding. And if you are familiar with shape memory-based materials, this is not a desirable form for creating that overall stability of the shape memory response. So if we now go to looking at shape memory behavior, if you're familiar with this, you go from a permanent shape, you heat it, you then deform it, so you apply a load to it, and then you cool it to fix it into that temporary shape. So you go from a permanent shape to a temporary shape, it's fixed, and then you unload it, and then you want to recover back the permanent shape. That's the shape memory cycle. And that's really driven by this balance of net points and switch points, which are dominated by whether you have reversible hydrogen bonding or if you have these more ordered segments. So here there are 2 parameters that are important in this, the fixing ratio and the recovery ratio. Here you can see that the alpha helical structures in this well-separated morphology tend to give you better shape fixing, which is not supported by the fact that you have a phase mixed structure in these materials. So our systems, you have those in red, actually have a higher shape fixing, and then you actually have a moderate recovery ratio in these systems. So using what we know about spider silk and capturing some of this beta sheet and alpha helical character, we're able to make these shape memory material systems. We can also start to make dynamic hydrogels. Now, why do we care? Of course, we know that hydrogels are used ubiquitous in a lot of different applications, but typically, if you think about a traditional, say, PEG hydrogel, they don't have a lot of function. But if we want to make more sophisticated structures that mimic biological tissues, we need to derive some function in them, right? And one of the biggest challenges is this mechanical strength. So for dynamic network systems, we want them to be responsive, to be self-healing, and to be shear thinning. And we wanted to be able to use our understanding of making these polypeptide structures, these silk-inspired biohybrid materials, as a way to build complex and reversible interactions. So if you're unfamiliar with injectable hydrogels, essentially you're taking a material system and you're applying a force, and it goes through these phases. You have a solid-like behavior at rest. When you apply the force to it, you want it to yield under flow, so you want it to move. And then once you remove that force, you want the network to recover, right? So for us, we wanted to think about ways we could use our silk-inspired hybrids to do this. So again, we go back to our inspired systems here. Instead, we're using a polyethylene glycol to give us kind of more of that hydrogel type of component. And we've chosen 2 different peptides, one being lysine, which is often used for biological systems, and then PBLA. And here, primarily, we're using this to modulate secondary structure. Lysine is primarily a alpha helical forming peptide. PBLA, you can get some moderate amount of alpha helical content depending on the block length and solvent that you use. What's nice is that for something like lysine especially, you can use deprotection to create these material systems that both have a pH response and can also be chemically modified through something like click chemistry. Here we show that we looked at these at different block lengths, both in lysine and PBLA form, and that we are able to get different secondary structures. At the top, these different vials gives you a indication that we're able to make these physical hydrogels. So A, B, C, and D at the top show that A and B, which are the lysine-based systems, all are self-supporting if you invert the vial. Whereas D, which is our control-based system, still flows. So the peptide is really driving this. You also can see really nice pore structures of these materials through some cryo work. You can see here using circular dichroism studies that you have alpha helical character in all of our gel forming hybrid materials, whereas the PBLA has more of a random coil or beta turn. So the gelation mechanism that's happening in these systems is really driven by the fact that we have this alpha helical character to our materials, which is important in our design as you start to think about ways in which secondary structure and hierarchy are able to help us derive different function. You can see here some of these dense fibrillar networks that are formed in our system. So at different block lengths at 10 weight percent, you can see really nice, strong, higher order assembly, which gives us these self-supporting gels that are important for this process. Now, I started by saying we wanted to make injectable hydrogels. So here you can nicely see that these are thermally stable. That's on the right. You can see that we can modulate the gel mechanics of these systems through concentrations. So you can go to 5 to 25 weight percent, and you can start to see higher gel mechanics, which is important. You can also start to see on the right-hand side, if we look at just the modulus versus temperature and these rheological experiments, you see a couple of things. These are quite thermally stable over a very wide temperature range, which is phenomenal. The fact that we've made these systems that they can be stable at these different use temperatures is really important. You can start to see there's minimal hysteresis until you get to something that has more of the beta sheet character. So these alpha helical structures give us these very thermally stable systems, but they're also ones that have very minimal hysteresis. We're able to achieve network recovery. So we want them to be solid-like until we apply a force to them, and you can see this. We inject them, and you see almost instantaneous recovery. You then can inject them over multiple cycles, and you see instantaneous recovery. So we have sufficient mechanical strength, and we also are able to recover these systems. And we just recently published this paper in Soft Matter earlier this year. We also can take these concepts of silk-inspired material systems and start to think about making other types of networks. So I'm wearing amphiphilic co-networks right now. I'm wearing contact lenses, okay? So contact lenses, and so those material systems, you want them, of course, to have a high degree of hydration. You want them to be mechanically robust. I tend to rub my eyes a lot, which means that I tend to tear my contact lenses. So being able to make them more robust. Here we work with partners, so talking about international partnerships, this is actually a colleague who was originally in Switzerland. He moved to Scotland and is now in Germany, but he's a part of we have a center on bio-inspired materials funded by the National Science Foundation. We're actually wrapping up our last year with that particular center. But here, what he did was take our concepts of spider silk, taking these soft segments that we're adding and use them in a hydroxyethyl acrylate based system. And here he made these co-networks where you have one that's more hydrophilic, and then you have a hydrophobic phase. So the HEA provides the hydrophilicity. And then what's typically the hydrophobic phase is a PDMS. Here we're using our PDMS PBLA constructs as a way to see how secondary structure could impact these properties. Just a couple of things that I'll highlight here is that even though we're adding in a more hydrophobic component to these material systems, we get a higher degree of swelling and water in these material systems. We're still trying to understand the mechanism, but the fact that we're able to use this, much like if you think about spider silk with supercontraction with water, you're using these interesting hierarchy to control its interactions with water, is extremely interesting and viable for this particular process. You also can see that there are variations in peptide composition that allow you to have much higher overall modulus and toughness than their control systems. And one thing that I really like, especially for someone like myself who tends to tear my contact lenses, here you can see that over multiple cycles, if you stretch these material systems, you can actually recover, right? So you can heal these material systems using solvent, right? So this is extremely, viable if we start to think about the way things like amphiphilic co-networks are used. So using this inspiration from nature, we've been able to demonstrate utility in things like shape memory, injectable hydrogels, and now these amphiphilic co-networks, and many other examples, but I don't want to belabor the point. We also have shifted to thinking about water responsive material systems, and this is actually an area of research that was inspired by some of the work that the student that I mentioned to you from Sri Lanka did in my group, Nandula, making these responsive composites. When you typically think about water responsive composites, you're interested in using some type of filler to go from a stiff state to a soft state. And that's usually by going in these on and off systems without the need for an external energy source. They're used in a variety of applications like architecture, smart textiles, and then of course in soft robotics. So there's a lot of interest in these responsive material systems. Traditionally, your nanocomposite has something like nanocellulose as a filler, right? So lots of hydroxyl groups, you can create these water transport channels. They also convey a lot of reinforcement to the system due to their high specific stiffness. But typically the matrices are quite passive. And it's the filler-filler interactions that tend to drive the water responsiveness, which means that the stiffness differential that you would need to have a high degree of mechanical tunability is missing. In our approach, we're interested in taking our spider silk inspired matrix materials that have non-covalent interactions and hierarchy to create a more active matrix material system, and then to use cellulose nanocrystals as our water transport channel. And the idea here is much like in natural material systems, there are many levels of interactions that can occur. And so we're using these to expand the connections and water adaptive behavior in these materials. And this is something that we recently patented. So here we're using polyethylene glycol again, that gives this hydrophilic nature. And then we have our peptide, which allows us to tailor interactions, and then our CNCs. So a couple things that happen. So if we add in our CNCs, we can show that there's a shift in the hierarchical assembly, and that leads to disruption of secondary structure. So if you look at these ATR, FTIR, and then these wide-angle X-ray scattering plots, you can start to see that as you go from the control-based systems to adding in the CNCs, you're disrupting the secondary structure, and that's also borne out in the AFM plots there. If you look at the solid state mechanics, you start to see that we can get them homogeneously dispersed, and that we are limiting filler-filler interactions and promoting interactions with the matrix material. And we know that because we used a Halpin-Tsai model to look at these materials. And that tells us that we are limiting filler-filler interactions, and the CNC nanofillers are dispersed in the system. So as we add CNCs, we're actually changing the mechanics in these materials minimally. Now, what does it have to do with water responsiveness? So here you can see these are DMA curves in the system. We're looking at storage modulus versus time. So we start with a material that's dry and we add water to it. And this differential between the wet and the dry state is a proxy for the extent of adaptiveness to water, or the sensitivity to water. And you can see that this changes. So I'll try to click in all the animation here. So as we look at the impact of peptide content, as we change the peptide content, we're actually decreasing the water adaptiveness. And that's because we are using those as physical crosslinks that limit water diffusion. But when we add in our CNC content, we are getting more dynamic hydrogen bonding and changes in the way we have our morphological impact. So the secondary structure is changing, and we get an increase in the water responsivity, and a large increase that's shown here. Now, if we look at traditional water responsive mechanically adaptable components, you can see that they have a much lower responsivity than our system. So our work is highlighted with this, which is circled in red here. So when we have polymer matrices that are not adaptive, we don't really have a wide range of delta E or water adaptability. But when we can drive this through hierarchy and other interactions, we get a huge increase in the overall water responsivity. So we're really excited about being able to expand this for things like soft robotics and other applications, all through a bio-inspired lens. We can also get actuation that's driven by this. Here's just a simple example of our material system during the softening and being able to get kind of curling that occurs in these particular systems. So we are excited about this provisional patent that was just filed in March of this year. All right. Now I'm going to go back. I wanted to get to the bio-inspired stuff because I heard that as a compelling interest. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Go back.
Just a quick question, who is a Sri Lankan student in that list?
So that student, that wasn't his work, but he inspired some of it from before. His name was Nandula Wanasakara. So I'll go back to our conversation around plastics pollution. So I talked a little bit about plastics waste and ways we can valorize that. But I want to go back to thinking about feedstock potential through using bioderivable components. So if we start to think about sustainable polymers, there is a need for us to really transform how we think about plastics production in the context of using bio-based feedstocks. So here's a review article that came out a couple of years ago out of National Renewable Energy Lab in the US, where typically the way we think about past and present, I think this goes to the conversation that we had earlier about sustainable bio-based packaging. You can use petroleum, you can use biomass, but we still have the same linear model, right? We use, we dispose, and it's waste, right? What that waste is, we don't know. It could be new degradation products that we haven't imagined how they're going to interact with our environment or with our bodies. But in the future, we need to think about all waste, whether that comes from petroleum or bio-derived sources, in this more circular model where there's use and reuse or mitigation to new resources. So that requires a lot of things. We've already talked about computation and data science, innovations related to new feedstocks and chemistries that are enabled by catalysis, life cycle assessment, being able to understand how we can manufacture these new bio-based materials, looking at the environmental and health impacts, and really being able to transform how we teach about new sustainable polymers in our current educational models. And so if we start to think about this, we need to examine building blocks that move beyond this linear system where we take harmful or petroleum-derived precursors, we make more single-use plastics, and then it goes to waste. We need to think about ways to deal with both thermoplastics and thermosets. And there are many ways that we can do that. So we have to think about new pathways to high performance materials. So this Van Craveland plot, highlights the fact that we can start to think about things like lignin, right, as a resource that's competitive with a lot of more functional systems. So one that have more heteroatoms in them, like polyurethanes and nylons, right? We start to see these systems being competitive as replacements for things like polyurethanes, polysulfones, polyesters, and Dow polyurethanes is example here on the bottom. So being able to use aromatics derivable from something like lignin are important to start thinking about for high performance applications. So why is lignin an attractive surrogate? I'll go here, go through all the animation. So it has a large feedstock availability, especially in the US. It's one that is a byproduct of the pulp and paper industry. Over 1 million tons are produced per year, and it is 15 to 30% of lignocellulosic biomass. It is non-food source competing. So a lot of the bio-based materials that we are currently making come from our food sources, corn, others, right? So using lignin, which is already a byproduct, and waste is something that we can start to think about. It is also the largest natural source of aromatics. And so a lot of the high performance materials that we talk about, of course, are aromatic. There's been a huge advance in catalytic methods to deconstruct lignin that allows you to get this bis-guaiacol synthesis, these bisphenol structures that also have additional functional handles that I'll talk a little bit more about that can be extremely important. We've also done some preliminary studies that show that they have lower estrogenic activity compared to something like bisphenol A, and we can start to get enhanced thermomechanical properties. Now, this is usually an exam question on any class, in any class that I teach. What is Professor Korley's favorite class of materials? And that is polyurethanes. And polyurethanes make up about 8% of global plastic demand. What's nice about polyurethanes is that you can make a wide range of materials by just mixing building blocks, right? So you can make elastomers, you can make coatings, you can make foams. And you can get materials that have all types of things. You can have chemical resistive layers. You can use them as matrices for different composites. You can make all types of foams from everything from packaging to furniture. And most of us are probably wearing something that has polyurethane in it right now. Traditional polyurethanes, though, have limitations related to human environmental safety. So traditionally, it's made from a polyol and an isocyanate, and you start to see the aromaticity similarity to what I talked about for lignin. But they are usually, of course, derived from non-renewable resources like petroleum. And they can have reproductive, developmental, and systemic different types of toxicity. Also can be harmful to the aquatic system. It can be carcinogenic, and it uses phosgenes to make the precursors for the isocyanates, okay? So there are a long list of things that, even though this is a very useful material, it's one of my favorite classes, it is my favorite class of materials, there are ways that we need to start reimagining how we think about polyurethane technology. So we can reimagine that with something called non-isocyanate polyurethanes. So that is more sustainable in and of itself. Much like traditional polyurethanes, you now take a cyclic carbonate and a diamine, so you can choose your flavor of cyclic carbonate and diamine, and you put these together, you now make a non-isocyanate polyurethane, and they look structurally similar, except for these pendant hydroxyl groups. But those are useful, and we'll come to that in a moment. So we have very similar advantages, but there's also the opportunity, of course, that it is isocyanate free, that you can use CO2 CO2 is sequestered in the production of making the cyclic carbonate, and then you have these free hydroxyl groups that are important. So we're really excited about being able to take this more sustainable synthetic method, but also use lignin with these material systems. So lignocellulosic biomass, you can see all of the different types of renewable aromatics that you can achieve with a variety of different functionality. And for us, we also have a center funded by the National Science Foundation called the Growing Convergence Research Center. My colleague, Thomas Epps, is the director of that particular center, which is really focused on life cycle management. So can we take these renewable aromatics? Can we create different types of thermal sets? Can we understand seasonal variations in lignin sources? Understanding kind of the soft and hardwood content based on geodiversity. Can we work with plant and crop scientists? Can we work with toxicologists to understand the entire aspect of the life cycle of a plastic product? So this involves people from all of those different departments, plus a lot of life cycle and techno-economic analysis in this. And the idea here is, can we really capitalize upon this diversity? So one of the first things I kind of alluded to this is that we did a structure estrogenic activity study, a molecular docking study with this is actually an undergraduate student who was the first author of this paper. And she compared conventional materials, so things like bisphenol F and bisphenol A, which only vary by these bridging carbon substitutions, and compared those to those in the green which could be made from lignin. And we showed that by changing the methoxy content and of course increasing the methoxy content and thus the polarity, we get a reduction in the estrogenic activity. So before we even make the material, we can know that our starting components are actually less harmful to the body. We then use these to make different NIPUs. You can see that we can make nice films of these. We can make, one of the limitations of NIPUs is that typically their molecular weights are limited. So usually about 20,000 kilograms per mole, which is much different from traditional polyurethanes. But nicely, you can see that we have been able to push to at least the largest limits currently reported for NIPUs. But we can also shift the glass transition temperature shown in this heat glow versus temperature, where it's increasing as a function of methoxy content and methyl substitution as shown here. So within a series, you can see that the unsubstituted systems has less of an increase or lower, of course, than those of the dimethyl substituted systems. Nicely, you can see that depending on the bridging carbon as well as the methoxy group, you get variations in the mechanical properties. So the methoxy groups get greater extensibility, where the bridging carbons lead to enhanced toughness and strength. And this is done, so we did some calculations for the hydrogen bonding character of these material systems. You can see as you shift those, you're changing the hydrogen bonding character of the materials. Rheologically, you're able to make materials that have comparable processability to their petroleum-derived counterparts, which is important. Just because you have very similar thermomechanical properties does not mean that you can always process these in the right way. We can also make thermosets of these using a very similar process. And here we compare different types of lignin-derivable cyclic carbonates, but we also look at different types of amines, so short chain and long chain amines. You can make these into nice films. There's always a little bit of yellow color to these lignin-based systems. But the gel fraction, 100% in the short chain, a little bit lower than that in the long chain systems. It's a very simple process to make these films. But a couple of things that go back to what I talked about in the beginning about polyurethane technology. We wanted to get variations. So a couple of things happen is for the methoxy groups, you get a reduction in the glass transition temperature as you increase those. As you change the bridging carbon substitution, you get an increase in the TG. So you can really, within a series, control the glass transition temperature of these materials, going from low to high, which gives you a handle for performance optimization. The short chain systems, as you would expect, based on the crosslink character, has higher glass transition temperature. But nicely, we can tune the mechanics. So I started by saying that you can make polyurethanes as, they can be matrices for composites, you can make them into coatings and elastomers. And just through tuning of these building blocks, we can do the same thing here. We actually can use materials that have a lower toughness, a lower yield, higher yield strength, and then make more tough and flexible networks on the other side through the choice of building blocks as well as the amine structure. So for us, we're really excited about this framework, and this also has a recent patent application for this work. We can make a variety of other types of thermosets as well, and we can use this to make different network engineering approaches. All right, and so with that, I'll go to what should have been my last slide, which is to thank the people who have done the work. They don't let me in the lab anymore. The students don't want me in the lab, but really excited about my team who's done a fantastic job in working in this space. This is a recent picture in Delaware with the fall colors, which I always enjoy this season. Collaborators across various institutions, but also the world, and some of the support that we have. Chemours is funding one of my PhD students to do some plastics recycling. Dow has been extremely supportive through both advisory board work, but also material support for our center, and then some of the other funding agencies that have given us that. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. Quick question. I just have, you said about the injectable hydrogels, and you showed like the knee.
Cartilage.
Cartilage. I mean, have you worked on that? I mean, answer to these cartilage replacements.
So, yes, but not in that context. So for cartilage replacement, we made some fiber reinforced hydrogels using a co-extrusion process. And we're able to recapitulate some of the function, but also the low hysteresis, those materials so you can get much cycling. So we've done that, but not the work that I showed here.
I am not now engaged with hydrogel, but there are few of staff members not here. Jakuga, they are with hydrogel for this biomedical.
Morato also
Part of that. Yes.
But we've been unable to commercialize that at the moment.
This biomedical
is the foot sole hydrogel.
Great.
is that go back to
Yeah, Ruan left, so I can't. I was looking at him to get an answer question. I'm not sure whether we have gone through that much of characterization.
No, this is a characteristic one is fantastic. Right?
So it's
What about this non-isocyanate polyurethane? So very interesting.
Yeah, so that's a very new area. It's a hot area in the US right now, both from creating linear systems as well as the thermoset-based systems, especially foams, because nicely you do two things. You eliminate the use of isocyanates, but you also can use CO2 sequestration. So that's another energy.
Covering all the spectrum of the polyurethane, like soft glass.
We can do that. That's what we've been showing. I think right now there's a lot of new efforts to kind of show that space, but even in the example that I showed you in the thermoset, you can go from soft to hard.
From soft to hard on spectrum. Now, what about the level of that research? It's like a semi-commercial level, which is already research level.
So it is not commercialized yet. We're working hard on doing that right now. That's the work that we're trying to do.
It's a breakthrough. One of the breakthrough.
Yeah, I think so.
The violence that the other one, spider. What about the level of that research? It's still going on.
So there are lots of people interested in spider silk. So there's work that's been done on genetic engineering of spider silk, making a lot in the biomedical space, naturally. There are computational, trying to understand spider silk and its mechanical properties and those types of things. So there's a huge effort, at least in the US and some in Europe, on this space. Our take was a little different. The first time I gave a talk on spider silk to a company, they said to me, "This is great work, but how much is it going to cost me?" So going back to this cost discussion, okay? So for our perspective, what we wanted to do was to find a way to get the minimal amount of order that you would see in spider silk and make it into materials that are more commercial, lend themselves more to commercial makeup, right? So using N-carboxy anhydride polymerization, we're just making amino acids, right? Which is easy for us to do. We're still using polyurethanes. And so our approach is slightly different, and especially we focus on the solid state properties primarily.
And a different question you said about the patenting. I heard that in US, say you have your research student goes into a conference and you need to wait it for patent protection. Like you don't want to disclose. Can you quickly claim some patent protection by kind of like mailing the PowerPoint presentation that you're going to do for the conference?
So
is that system active in US?
So it's not as simple as mailing the PowerPoint, but it's almost that simple. Ironically, my husband is the person who does the tech transfer at the University of Delaware, so he's over that office. And so he has made it pretty simple where you can do an invention disclosure, right? And so that invention disclosure is a form. You go through, you fill it out, and you can add, you know, a PowerPoint presentation, you can add a manuscript draft, you know, you can do any of those things with why this is important and why it needs to be protected. So we do have within our tech transfer office the ability to quickly respond to researchers who say, hey, this is a discovery that I want to protect. Can we go ahead and do this? It's a pretty low barrier process to do.
Still get your 12 months or 18 months. Different question, but related to what Professor asked. Now, let's say you're working in a team. I mean, I can see it's a big team, and there are a lot of industry collaborations working with your team. Now, let's say accidentally you, or rather knowing one of your partner taking your IP before you get the IP rights, taking the findings out and presenting or showing to someone else. What will be the legal setup in your university? How you are going to charge or punish that particular person?
So typically, when you're working with industry, before you have a framework for how things are disclosed, right? And it's typically more onerous on the academic, right? That if I'm doing anything with industry, usually it's written in there. That if I want to present a paper, you know, if I want to present at a conference, or I want to submit a paper, it has to have approval from them before it gets submitted. So everyone agrees on it, right? So there shouldn't be any chance of disclosure. It's on me to educate my students about this process, right? So to not go and talk to your friend at a meeting or whatever about this, right? But typically you don't have a problem because there are MOUs, there's, you know, company agreements where you know what needs to be followed in this process.
If something happens to be the procedure, or it's a student taking your findings without informing you how you are going to deal with it.
So I think there are two parts of that. So typically our students, like, they can't submit an abstract. So if you submit an abstract to a conference or you submit, you have to add, you're supposed to add all the authors and notes. So everything should come to me if someone submitted anything. When those cases happen, then you can go to that conference or that publisher and say this was submitted without my approval or knowledge, and it's unsubmitted, okay? Students typically can't go to conferences because they need financial backing, so it's not like they can go without me signing something saying that they can go.
And my point is, like, you know, a student is stating the data belongs to the research, and or rather leaving the research. So what will be the end story of it?
Like going to another company, the competitor company that's trying to do the same thing, or wants little insight into how funded projects.
So you mean after they've graduated, or?
Yeah, I mean, while let's say I'm working with you, you're my supervisor, but I mean, halfway through, I take all the data and I'm leaving the team.
So I mean, that office can definitely go after. We have a whole legal team. Can go after someone like that if we can show that that information has been taken. I've never run into the case. I haven't personally, and most of the companies that you are. I've never run into that particular case, but there are scenarios when there are protections. It's written into like their graduate contracts, right? About who owns the information, the IP. So the university can go into, can fight that battle on behalf of the researchers.
In a nutshell, you have a separate legal supporting system to assist you on these legal matters.
Yes.
So it's managed by contracts with the graduate students when they sign up, and then it's like infringement of the contract that the university would go after.
Right, because the graduate students, and I don't know all the information about it, but it's who owns the IP, right? And who owns the technology. And it's the same thing that happens for me. Like, I don't own it. It's owned by the university. You're doing it on university property. And so that's what you're bound by as an employee of the university. And so that's what they have to function on.
It's all about the qualities and ethics, but unfortunately, there are ups and downs. But I mean, especially when you're working with industry, they are very particular on this. Now, let's say there are competitors. I do research with one company, and if the finding goes to their competitor, it will be a big loss for the people who are funding the research.
So if you're with a company, if a student is working on a company project, there are many more checks and balances, right? In terms of where information is stored, right? So how we store information, how data is managed. There are more like what can actually be shown, even at a group meeting with all the other students. Everything can't be shown, right? Which is why for a lot of industry, if they're working with a graduate student especially, usually there are projects that are not like trade secret that would transform something. They're usually things that provide the foundational knowledge that then they can in-house use to tackle the real problem. If I've had a project with a company where I would then put a postdoc on that project because they're bound differently. So they can actually sign a non-disclosure agreement. That way, there is a protection specifically around that if it's very, very specific, if they're going to be going and using that company's materials or something like that.
Thank you. That's quite an exhaustive of research and stuff that has come through from Delaware and from your lab and group. So it's very inspiring, and I hope during the tea break that we had a chance to make the connections, or to a Delaware connection with two heads and the direct international relations. So I think in our next stages we are going to visit two departments, starting with material science and then ending up material science and engineering, and then chemical engineering, because we are doing sharply virtuals that you have heard. So may I quickly invite Professor Lanarol to have a token of appreciation to Professor Korley. Thank you. With that, we can close up this session at FGS, the visitor talk. And thank you all for joining online. Yes, we did ask for questions, but there were no questions came through the chat. But anyway, I hope it was quite an interesting exposure to this topic. I must thank, in final, I must just thank Joveen for the support and all the coordination in having this event, which I think is something that we're beginning of something, relationship. I also have to thank one more individual, Professor Terni Pradeep Kumar, who is actually not here. It's from the University of Rwanda, who actually enabled this to happen by connecting, and your visit was informed and said, by all means, we would like to have you with here at Moratorium. So, Terni, thanks to you as well. So with that, we can conclude today's session, this opening session, and we can have the university tour.
Thank you.